Happy lunch hour, gang. Those that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We all know that. In this election period, if you will, and especially after 2020, we're all concerned with the stop the steal, too big to rig. Nobody can honestly believe that Kamala Harris is the Democrat candidate for president after she couldn't even make it in 2020 to the primaries, right? But now all of a sudden she's the second coming. You hear stories all the time about people saying we've got to do whatever we can to stop the steal and that there's corruption everywhere. Open the news every day and we see stories about Arizona just coming out and saying that the 2020 election was crooked. Georgia's come out and said the 2020 election was crooked, that Trump won both those states. You're hearing stories now out of Pennsylvania that 2020 was crooked. And you wonder what's going to happen in November when they start announcing these results and nobody believes them. Okay. You go back in history, and if you talk to probably 95% of the people in the country, they're going to come up and say the last time we had a fight on American soil over politics was the Civil War. Now, that wasn't over corrupt voting or anything like that. You could say go back to the Revolutionary War and we wanted to vote, but neither one of those would be right. There's actually a story that probably most people were never taught that is in relatively recent history. It's just barely 75 years ago, where we had an issue where there was corruption, cheating, and flat out lies being told to the people with their elections about how they voted. It's McMinn County, Tennessee, which I'm guessing most people don't know where it is. It's down near Chattanooga, so southeast corner of Tennessee. In 1946, there was an event, and rather than talk, I'm going to read to you the short story. But I want you to listen to this because this is basically the precedence for what could feasibly happen this year. So let me just read this to you. Citizens of McMinn County had long been concerned about political corruption and possible election fraud. The U.S. Department of Justice had investigated allegations of election fraud in 1940, 1942, and 1944, but had not taken action. That doesn't sound familiar at all, does it? Okay. In 1936, the system descended upon McMinn County in the person of one Paul Cantrell, a Democrat candidate for sheriff. Cantrell, who came from a family of money and influence in nearby Etowah, tied his campaign closely to the popularity of the Roosevelt administration and rode FDR's coattails to victory over his Republican opponent. Now we could talk about Biden, Harris riding Obama's coattails. Again, we're still very similar. Paul Cantrell was elected sheriff in the 36, 38, and 1940 elections and was elected to the state senate in 1942 and 1944, while his former deputy, Pat Mansfield, was elected sheriff. A state law enacted in 1941 had reduced local political opposition by reducing the number of voting precincts from 23 to 12 and reducing the number of justices of the peace from 14 to 7. Now, you've got to remember this time frame. This is back in the mid 20th century, and the South was very blue. Okay, so I want you to remember this. The sheriff and his deputies worked under a fee system whereby they received money, in other words, got paid, for every person they booked, incarcerated, and released. The more arrests, the more money they made. Buses passing through the county were often pulled over, and the passengers were randomly ticketed for drunkenness. whether guilty or not. You can start putting parallels to current times on that. In the August 1946 election, Paul Cantrell was once again a candidate for sheriff, while Pat Mansfield sought the state Senate seat. Okay. After World War II ended, some 3,000 military veterans, consisting of about 10% of the county population, had returned to McMinn County. Some of the returning veterans resolved to challenge Cantrell's political control by fielding their own nonpartisan candidates and working for a fraud-free election. Now, we're not quite nonpartisan, but I'd say you can all agree that MAGA has kind of diverted itself from the standard GOP platform. They called themselves the GI Nonpartisan League. There were several beer joints and honky-tonks around Athens. They were pretty wild. They started having trouble with law enforcement at that time because law enforcement started picking up GIs and fining them for about anything they could. They're making a racket out of it. Okay, they were collecting corrupt money. Where would that come from? After long, hard years of service, most of the people were hardcore veterans of World War II. They were used to drinking their liquor and their beer without being molested. When these things happened, the GIs got madder and madder and madder. The more GIs they arrested, the more they beat, and the more they got beaten up, the madder they got. Okay. Polls for the county election opened on August 1st, 1946. About 200 armed deputies turned out to patrol the precincts, the original poll watchers. Okay. The normal complement of 15 deputies was significantly augmented by reinforcements from other counties. A number of conflicts arose before the polls closed, the most serious of which was when a black man, Tom Gillespie, was assaulted by officers after casting his vote. A deputy, C.M. Wise, shot and wounded Mr. Gillespie in the back while he was trying to escape from the officers. The deputy was later sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison. Okay. As the polls closed, deputies seized the ballot boxes and took them to the jail so they could count them where nobody was watching. Okay. Opposition veterans responded by arming themselves and marching to the jail. Some of them had raided the National Guard armory, obtaining arms and ammunitions. Estimates of the number of veterans besieging the jail go anywhere from a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand. Okay. When the men reached the jail, it was barricaded and manned by 55 deputies. The veterans demanded the ballot boxes. They were refused. But then they opened fire on the jail, initiating a battle that lasted several hours. Some people said a little more, some people said a little less. But in the end, the door to the jail was dynamited, and breached. They were taping like 3 sticks of dynamites together, throwing them almost like grenades, blowing up cars, and blew the door to the jail so they could get in. The barricaded deputies eventually surrendered. Some of them were injured, and the ballot boxes were recovered. During the fight, rioting had broken out in nearby Athens, mainly targeting the police cars, and continued even after the ballot boxes were recovered. After recovering the ballot boxes and doing an honest count, it was about an 80-20 vote for the GI group, the ones who were trying to stop the steal, who were actually getting elected. The recovered ballots certified the election of 5 GI nonpartisan league candidates. Among some of the reforms they put in were a change in the method of payment for the police. They only got $5,000, no more paying people for arresting people. Okay. They shut down a bunch of illicit gambling houses, and they destroyed the entire Cantrell regime. Deputies that were appointed prior had resigned and were replaced. So they got rid of all the corruption. Now, the GI Nonpartisan League didn't go anywhere. Again, you went from one group on an extreme to another group on an extreme, And eventually, Southeast Tennessee wound up back in a democratic process, okay? You know, our current roughly two-party system, that we didn't have craziness. But don't ever think that this isn't possible, that this is not going to happen. It happened in 1946, 78 years ago, where in order to protect the vote, you had a gunfight. Now, granted, the world's a little different than it was in 1946 than it is in 2024. But when you hear all these people, that are wishing for a gunfight, that's crazy. But when you hear all the people on the other side saying it's never going to happen, that, you know, the Democrats, the liberals, the soy boys on Facebook and Twitter are saying, oh, gee, we're just going to do whatever the hell they want. What are you going to do about it? There's a group of a couple of thousand men in one county who said, hell no, you're not stealing my country from me. You're not doing this to me. You're not arresting me for no reason so you can collect a bigger paycheck. You're not tormenting tourists. Does any of this ring familiar to what's going on now? Most of it should. Because in about 80 days, we could potentially see the same thing, especially around Atlanta, around Philadelphia, I don't know, maybe around Detroit or Minneapolis or Milwaukee or Phoenix or Las Vegas. In all these counties where the people are coming out and saying, that ain't how we voted, but all of a sudden at 3 o'clock in the morning, you get one of these. Just something to pay attention to and remember a little bit about history. Because all those that say it can't happen obviously are the ones that want to revise history. Pinball out.